Okay, I think we'll begin. So welcome to the Korea Economic Institute. I'm Mark Tokola, the Vice President of KEI. KEI was founded in 1982 for the purpose of promoting dialogue and understanding between the United States and the Republic of Korea. So to see more of our events and activities and programs and publications, I invite you to look at our website, which is at keia.org. So for a round of introductions, Ambassador Kathleen Stevens is the William J. Perry Distinguished Fellow for Korean Programs at Stanford University. She's the former U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of Korea and served as Chargé d'Affaires in India from March to December of 2014. She was acting Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs during 2012. Ambassador Stevens earlier served in Washington as the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of East Asia and Pacific Affairs. If you see me acting a bit deferentially towards her, it's because she was my boss at the embassy in Seoul. Next is Mr. Ashley Tellis, who is a senior associate at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, specializing in international security, defense, and Asian strategic issues. While on assignment to the U.S. Department of State as senior advisor to the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, he was intimately involved in negotiations of the civil nuclear agreement with India. He also served on the National Security Council as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Strategic Planning and for Southwest Asia. Next to Mr. Tellis is Mr. Scott Snyder, who is the Senior Fellow for Korea Studies and Director of the Program on U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations, where he served as an Adjunct Fellow from 2008 to 2011. Prior to joining CFR, Mr. Snyder was a Senior Associate in the International Relations Program at the Asia Foundation, where he founded and directed the Center for U.S.-Korea Policy. He served as the Asia Foundation's representative in Korea from 2000 to 2004. And those of you who follow Korean policy in Washington know he's one of the most respected voices in the field. We could not have a better panel to discuss India, South Korea, and the United States. To set the stage just for a minute, South Korea is usually bracketed with other countries when you think about South Korean policy. So you have South Korea bracketed with South Korea, North Korea, or South Korea, Japan, or South Korea, China, or South Korea, US. It's not often that South Korea is bracketed with India, but each country, New Delhi and Seoul, is looking toward the other increasingly, and they take each other more seriously with time. You do not have to go back to ancient kingdoms to find connections between India and Korea. During the 1920s, one of the foreign writers most translated into the Korean language was the Indian Rabindranath Tagore, the first non-European to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. When Tagore was in Japan in 1924, he gave a speech in Tokyo warning the Japanese about the dangers of Japanese nationalism. And he also called for Korean independence in Tokyo during that speech in 1924. So Tagore wrote this: "In the golden age of Asia, Korea was one of its lamp bearers, and that lamp is waiting to be lighted once again for the illumination of the East." So with that, let's begin. We're going to do moderated dialogue, so I'm going to pose some questions to our panelists, and we'll have a conversation. So Ambassador Stevens, let's begin with you. While your time in India was briefer than your time in South Korea, you've had the chance to look at the perspective on U.S. relations with both countries. How do you see the U.S. relationship with Korea and India, and how it's doing?
Well, Mark, thank you. And in brief, I think the U.S. relationship with both India and the Republic of Korea is positive and good and more important than ever. But I do want to say thank you very much. It's great to see you again. You don't need to differential anymore. And I'm also really pleased to be here with Ashley and with Scott. They are the real experts, not only in India and Korea, respectively, but on U.S. engagement in the world. I mean, I think we're going to talk a lot about the relations among and between these different countries. And actually, one thing I'm very interested in is the relationship between South Korea and India. I happened to have a good friend during my time in Seoul who was the Indian ambassador to Korea, Scan Tael, and we caught up with each other again when I went to Delhi last year, and he gave me his book, India and the Republic of Korea. Oh. You know, it's not just former American diplomats that make a career of India after they retire. And this is a first in India. And in fact, Mark, there is a photograph of Tagore's statue in Daehongno.
Very nice.
And a lot of interesting things about the India-Korea relationship, which I think is a rich area, not yet really fully understood, certainly in the United States, but full of potential. But anyway, to answer your question very briefly, I'd say, obviously, the U.S.-South Korea relationship has its own context and history and character. It's a security alliance coming out of a war fought together. The U.S. and India, another very different kind of relationship, modern relationship, but also coming out of the post-war period. We can talk a lot about that, but I think what's striking to me as someone who came most recently from India and now back here in the United States is that the political leadership in all three countries are very committed to growing these relationships, to deepening them in their own ways, both bilaterally and also I would maybe later on say trilaterally. I believe would also be a way to look at it. It's notable. Last September, still new Prime Minister Modi was here in the United States for his visit. President Obama was chief guest earlier this year in India at the Republic Day. President Pak is going to be here next month. Mr. Modi is going to be in Silicon Valley next week to see a few tens of thousands of Indian Americans on the West Coast, I believe. So I think all those things are indications that not only are the relations, overall perceived to be in good shape, but there's a real commitment to growing them.
Mr. Tellis, welcome. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
During the Cold War, U.S.-Indian relations might be described as a bit distant. As Ambassador Stevens mentioned, President Obama was in India for the Republic Day celebrations. And now there's a joint strategic vision statement between the U.S. and India. So how have the U.S.-Indian relations changed?
Well, the short answer is for the better. And that's a welcome development. But let me go back to the characterization that you started out with. I think when you look at it from a distance, it does look like the United States and India were perpetually at odds during the Cold War. The reality, however, was a lot more complex because the United States has been, since India's founding, the largest single donor to Indian development, going back now 60 years. The United States was a great champion of Indian independence. And actually very early on, in fact, during Mr. Nehru's lifetime, the United States actually came to terms with Indian non-alignment. And it was only in the 70s, for a brief period, during the India-Pakistan War of 1971, during the Nixon administration in the United States, that relations really became scratchy. Of course, in 1974, India tested nuclear weapons. And that nuclear program became a source of great consternation. And that consternation survived for about 30 years until the Bush era, when President Bush negotiated a nuclear deal, which put the disagreement behind us. So it's a complex relationship that has had a series of highs and lows. But I think the relationship on balance has actually been closer than both sides might casually admit. Going forward, however, I think there is a common appreciation of the challenges that both sides face. And there is a common aspiration to make the relationship for the next 50 years dramatically different from what the relationship of the last 50 has been. So I, for one, am personally extremely optimistic that we are on a trajectory that has been very different from the past.
And Mr. Snyder, the U.S. and Korea have concluded a free trade agreement and have increased their cooperation in a range of fields from development assistance to climate change. Now, President Park will be visiting Washington in October. How would you assess the current state of U.S.-South Korean relations?
Well, the U.S.-Korea relationship is pretty solid right now. North Korea has done a lot to contribute to that, as usual. Most recently, we saw this escalation of tensions and actually an exchange of fire. And I think that the management of that whole issue has shown that behind the scenes, U.S.-Korea coordination kind of got a test drive and did quite well, at least in my estimation. It's always a challenge with regards to this tension between the possibility, risk of escalation, and the need to try to manage the inter-Korean dynamic. So that's one issue that I think both sides are going to be focused on in October. Also, I mean, both sides have indicated that they're going to focus on new global cooperation, new issues like cyber, like space. And I think that really is testimony to the fact that over the course of the past 5 to 7 years, we've seen a very vibrant agenda of functional cooperation on global issues that I think has been very positive for the U.S.-Korea relationship in terms of building it. I want to try to close the triangle, though, if you don't mind, because so far I've learned something from everybody who has spoken. But I just wanted to give my view on the Korea-India piece of this, because really, I think for a long time you could say that in some ways Korea and India were in parallel universes. They actually didn't really intersect with each other. And so obviously what brings us together today is the possibility and prospect of that particular intersection. And I think that there are two drivers, potentially, that we can think about as we think about that intersection. One is, ironically, the North Korea-Pakistan axis, which binds both sides together in a concern about proliferation. But I think the other one is actually the U.S. rebalance. And the question of, as U.S.-India relations strengthen, what new possibilities or opportunities does that raise for the way that Korea tries to envision its role in the region? And so I think that the fact that there is a kind of ramping up of Korea-India infrastructure for cooperation, if you look back in May when Modi came to Seoul, we saw that there's a pretty significant, at least on paper, a list of things that Korea and India want to do together. All of those, I think, are in the interest of the United States. And then the question is how to actualize that potential.
Because we're talking about triangular relationships, that kind of sets off on a different tangent. I wonder if you might talk about the relationship between the United States, China, and South Korea a little bit. U.S.-Chinese relations are becoming maybe the number one topic in Washington now. How does South Korea fit into that?
Sure. Well, that's, I would say, the primary focus of every Korean policymaker and opinion leader is where does Korea sit in the context of the U.S. and China. And of course, we just saw an event that stimulated a lot of focus on that question with President Park standing next to Putin and Xi Jinping at the Chinese War Commemoration Day. The symbolism of that event is complicated because I think that Americans probably looked at that picture and scratched their heads. And some of them were saying, oh, is South Korea moving over to the Chinese side? And I don't think that's the case at all. I think that what South Koreans saw is Kim's not there, Park is, right? And so they saw basically a symbolic strategic victory in that picture. And so I think it's important to understand that even though people are looking at the same picture, in that case, we might see very different things. And that actually, if you look at the underlying basis for Korea-Chinese engagement and the motivation of trying to bring North Korea in to the international community, in fact, what enables that, I think, is a strong U.S.-Korea alliance. And so even though there's a big debate in Korea about where Korea needs to be between the U.S. and China, I actually still see that particular debate as kind of a hypothetical creation by the pundits and not really I don't think that South Korea has reached any kind of critical decision point in that context.
Okay, Mr. Stevens or Mr. Tellis, do you have a view on the quadrilateral U.S., India, China, South Korea relationship?
Well, it's easier to think of the triangle first and then expand it. But I think the Indian calculation with respect to the US and China, I think, is twofold. One, India doesn't want to be in a position where it is compelled to choose between the two, because it has a reasonably flourishing, though complicated, economic relationship with China. But it values the relationship with the United States because American primacy, American power, the global regime that is an American-dominated regime, is very much in India's interest. So from the viewpoint of New Delhi, I think they would like to have the best of both worlds, which is to enjoy as flourishing an economic relationship with China as they can, while still maintaining very deep ties with the United States, with whom India does not have any serious security dilemmas or rivalries. Korea is important in this context because India sees the relationship with Korea and with Japan as really the entry points to a larger engagement with East Asia as a whole. And this is particularly something that is on Prime Minister Modi's agenda because he's looking to diversify India's relationships beyond merely the great powers of the past. And we can talk about the economic dimensions and the strategic dimensions of this.
Yeah, we might want to talk about the economic dimensions as we go on, but just to add, I think this is very well put. Maybe one other thought about the three, first of all. We throw around words like, common values, common interests pretty freely. I mean, one thing that really struck me as a newcomer to living in India when I went there last year is the passion and the commitment Indians feel for their democracy. As messy and inefficient, if I may say, as ours is, as it is at times. And that's what I see in Korea too. When I think about countries around the world, what I see is on the part of South Korea, on the part of India, on the part of the United States, a real commitment to our values and our democracy. And that is something that actually binds us together and keeps, I think, public opinion on the side of strengthening these relationships. When it comes to interests, I mean, as both of you have said, and I think in different ways, I mean, one, I don't think any of our countries, wants to be certainly in a zero-sum game where anybody's forced to choose between, rising powers and the status quo powers or superpowers. But we do have an interest in shaping a world that is changing with China's increasing influence, not only economic, but in other spheres. And in shaping not only a regional but a global order that does reflect our shared values, that does reflect rules that have served us well in development, in human rights, and in other areas. So I think that's the foundation that we all work from in trying to shape a world in which China is going to have a bigger role.
To shift the focus back to the country, I guess specifically for a while, just tell us, as India's economy has grown, it's become a more prominent player on the world stage, how have its foreign policy and strategic objectives evolved? Does it have an idea of a group of countries in Southeast Asia with which it wishes to cooperate closely? Or does it see the global spanning BRICS group as being more in its interest?
I don't think there is a clear or definite answer to that question just yet. Because India is just slowly adjusting to the reality of economic success. That economic success is by no means complete. What the Indians have tasted in the last 20 years is growth at levels that are way beyond the historic norm. And India's worldview is actually struggling to keep up with those changes in the material realm. One important point to keep in mind is that the old idea that India ought to constantly be non-aligned, which was really an idea that was rooted in India's geopolitical weakness, is slowly beginning to diminish. Because the Indians are groping to find a substitute for non-alignment. They haven't quite found it yet. But what they're looking for is active engagement with different countries depending on their interests, and driven increasingly by economic realities. And so I see India now thinking of its role in a much wider world than just South Asia. And if there are any two poles that matter particularly to this administration in Delhi, the first is the United States. This is very clear that Modi's foundation for his external relationship is a good relationship with the United States. But as I said before, looking to East and Southeast Asia as the opportunities for India in the future.
To follow up maybe even more specifically, would India welcome a stronger U.S. naval presence in the Pacific and Indian Ocean, or would they see it as being a cause for concern?
I think without doubt the answer today is yes. Now, you have to remember there's been a complicated history here. In the 1970s, the Indians were the first to jump on the bandwagon that was pushed by Sri Lanka to declare the Indian Ocean as a zone of peace. Now that the Chinese have entered the Indian Ocean in a serious and possibly permanent way, India sees the value of a US naval presence there in ways that it did not before. And so from an Indian point of view, the US presence in the Indian Ocean, and more generally, US preeminence in the Indo-Pacific, is extremely important for Indian security. So the challenge for India is how does it productively engage with the United States as a partner to bolster America's capacity to stay engaged, rather than take the position of an opponent that is somehow antagonistic to American presence. That is a world that has passed us by, and thankfully so.
Yeah. And I think there's a sense on the U.S. side that India has potential as a producer of security. Clearly, its role will depend in part on the success of its economic growth and development. But I think I think you see it reflected in the strategic the statements that have been made by the leaders that India and the U.S., along with other powers in East Asia and in the region, see themselves as working together to be providers of security, the kind of security that has allowed the economic growth we've seen in the region as a whole.
And then, Scott, getting back to the evolution of then South Korea's foreign policy. In the not too distant past, South Korea's policy seemed to hew very close to the United States, the focus on North Korea. How has the end of the Cold War and the evolution of South Korea influenced its foreign policy and strategic thinking?
I think it's true that in the Cold War context, South Korean foreign policy was really all about North Korea and the United States. And I think post-Cold War, what we've seen is a primary focus on the major power relationships. As Korea defines it, the relationships with the four powers surrounding the peninsula: Russia, China, the U.S., and Japan. And I think that more recently, what we've seen is the emergence of a kind of middle power concept in South Korea. And that concept, I think, is interesting to watch because, the other thing that has happened in Korea post-Cold War that has been of great benefit to Korea has been the development of a global economic presence and capability. And so I think that what we see is that South Korea's private sector economic capabilities actually outstrip its diplomatic presence in most parts of the world. And so I see this middle power concept really as about backfilling and trying to develop political and diplomatic strategies with other countries beyond the four powers proportionate to the economic engagement that already exists. So the great advantage that Korea has is that there is a base as a result of the economic experience that many countries have had. But the challenge, of course, is to try to prioritize and push forward a diplomatic rationale for cooperation that actually helps to solidify many of those relationships beyond the major powers. And so what I see is basically, relative weakness in terms of Korea's diplomacy with countries like Brazil or India or even in Southeast Asia, that now Korea is trying to rectify and strengthen.
Even recently, we had the program Global Korea, which was the term used by President Im Young-bak. The Park Geun-hye administration has dropped the words Global Korea. But do you think the ambition is still there?
I think that Korea has no choice but to be involved internationally, and that every president following Im Young-bak is going to realize that there is political benefit in maintaining the international profile. And so what are we going to see over the course of the next few months? Park Geun-hye is going to be in New York at the UN, participating in international discussions on sustainable development. Development is an area that Korea has performed well in. It's actually one of the attractions, I think, in the Korea-India relationship. Park Geun-hye is going to go to Paris, participate in climate change discussions. I mean, South Korea is involved in these issues in the G20 in ways that it's not going to want to or be able to walk away from. The really interesting question, I think, is more about the middle power dynamic. And there you've got this MICTA, Mexico, Indonesia, Korea, Turkey, and Australia. It's a funny group. It's not a regionally based group, but there is a kind of rationale for it in terms of common emerging democracies that care about a certain set of values, presumably. If they can develop a kind of issue-based coherence in the grouping. But in a way, I think that you talked about the BRICS earlier. In a way, one of the challenges for the Korea-India relationship is that there's the BRICS and then the MICTA. And so they're in different groups in their head, and they've got to break out of that. So I think that Korea is doing some interesting things in terms of trying to reach out, basically to make the aspiration to be a middle power a reality. It's a nice benchmark, I think, for Korean diplomats to try to develop those attributes, because many of them are positive attributes that I think would be beneficial to Korea and beneficial to the world if they're able to achieve them.
I just want to. I mean, I do think that the roots of global Korea, or whatever we're going to call it, Korea as a more global player, do go back, and even into the Cold War. I mean, I remember when I first lived in Korea in the 70s and then again in the 80s, there was still the battle for legitimacy, and South and North Korea were trying to open up as many embassies as they could around the world just to show that they had greater legitimacy. Well, I mean, that's sort of over. One, with the end of the Cold War, but also, it's clear that South Korea's kind of won that battle, if you like. But secondly, you have, Korea's drive for economic growth and development as the most trade-dependent, I think, other than maybe Singapore, which is a different kind of country in the world. And they looked to the markets that nobody else really wanted to go to, or they were pretty tough. Even way back in the 70s, they were going to Saudi Arabia. In the 90s, with the beginning of economic reforms, Hyundai was in India, building plants in India before they built in China. They were ready to go and commit to tough places, and this was clearly part of their economic strategy. But this is very, very much part of global Korea as well, and I think those are the roots of it.
I'm a fan of MICTA. It's a very interesting development. I think having a voice on the world stage of countries that are not the United States, but are democracies, and can take positions not necessarily seen as being U.S. positions, is helpful. MICTA issued a statement when the Malaysian airliner was shot down over Ukraine, condemning it as MICTA. And they've agreed to meet at the UN General Assembly as a group to discuss issues. So it's a good development. Mr. Tellis, in 2014, Park Geun-hye was the guest of honor for Republic Day in India. And while that took place prior to Prime Minister Modi's coming to office, then he visited South Korea earlier this year. But on the economic front, Korean companies seem to have some difficulties getting into the Indian market. Is there a perception in India of Korea as a strong economic as well as a strategic partner?
I think there's certainly the aspiration. The first point to be made, of course, is that all foreign companies have enormous difficulties penetrating the Indian market.
So do Indian companies.
So do Indian companies. So that's not unique to Korea. But as Kathy mentioned, I think Korea was really off the gate fairly early. They made the commitment to India at a time when India was an untapped market. And they've been actually very successful. They've certainly been more successful than the Japanese have been in India. And today, particularly this government, the Modi government, is deeply interested in deepening ties with Korea, first and foremost for economic reasons. They see Korea's achievements, particularly in infrastructure, in manufacturing, in science and technology, including defense, and in education, as really opening the door to a whole range of bilateral activities that they hope to bring to fruition. As Kathy mentioned, there are already Korean companies in India that are not simply manufacturing for the Indian market, but manufacturing for export from their Indian bases. And I expect that this will continue in the future. So from the Modi government's point of view, Korea is clearly one of the two big priorities in Northeast Asia for India. But there's also a strategic dimension to it. The effort right now in Delhi is to diversify India's engagements with countries that have essentially been successful. And if the country happens to be on China's periphery, so much the better. since Korea enjoys the benefits of geography in that sense, for India, working with Korea is really important because it gives them access to Northeast Asia. As Scott mentioned earlier, it gives them direct access to what the Koreans know and understand about North Korea, and particularly the North Korean-Pakistani connection. And people don't often know, but India and Korea actually signed very early an agreement for the protection of classified information on the assumption that the South Koreans could be helpful to Indian assessments of what is going on in the Pakistani and North Korean relationship. So there are clearly, there is a marriage of strategic interests and economic interests that have come together very nicely in the case of India-ROC relations.
I might just add, I think this is both economic and, well, just strategic. I've read accounts, and actually maybe you can tell me if they're accurate, that when Prime Minister Modi was chief minister of the state of Gujarat, which is a state of about 40, 50 million people, I think, he used to say very explicitly that he wanted Gujarat to be like South Korea. I think Korea as a development model, manufacturing-led development. I mean, there's a huge question, maybe beyond the purview of this conversation, of whether that works in a place like India in the 21st century. But that's very much in his mind with his kind of economy-first approach. But secondly, yeah, I wouldn't want to sort of underplay one the difficulties of working in India, but also the success of Korean firms. Samsung has a majority of the smartphone market, I believe. LG has a majority of the so-called white goods. I think they're all stainless steel now, but those are like washing machines and refrigerators, right? Hyundai is again mostly for the domestic market, but that will change. Is as 20% of the automotive share. So these are big numbers, but everything in India is big. That's but just in an anecdotal way, I mean, what I would hear from people in India who knew I had a connection with Korea as I went around was this doesn't surprise me. We saw it in the Middle East too. Is when Korean firms come, they're ready basically to put up with a lot, if I may say, and to be there for the long haul, and to really try to make the commitment to what they see as a strategic bet on the future of the relationship and also of the Indian economy and the potential of human capital in India.
I just want to reinforce what Kathy said, because if you go and look at the strategic partnership agreement that Prime Minister Modi and President Park signed last May in Seoul, it focuses on those specific sectors that were really important to Korea's development: shipbuilding, autos, steel, R&D capabilities. And so I think that you can really feel the experience, or I guess statements that Modi might have made in his previous incarnations spilling over into that particular agreement.
Can you follow up a little bit of the perception from Seoul of how India fits into its calculations then?
Well, I think that South Korea is always looking for emerging markets, and I would say that so far what I detect is a little bit more of an underdeveloped appreciation, frankly, of opportunities in the South Korea-India relationship. What I noticed, just going back and looking at coverage and remembering what I thought coverage of Prime Minister Modi's visit in Seoul, was actually that I thought that it didn't get as much attention as it deserved. It was kind of underplayed in the South Korean media. And so I think this goes back to what I was saying earlier about the challenge that South Korea has in terms of backfilling the political and security and diplomatic aspects of some of its relationships. And I think the Korea-India relationship is a prime example. There's the economic pole, and Prime Minister Modi got a chance to see all the leading CEOs of companies like Hyundai and Lotte and Samsung who have interest in foreign investment. But in terms of the kind of other dimensions of the relationship, I think that there's a lot more that can be done.
Yeah, when I was in Seoul, my colleagues in the Indian embassy were very proud of the fact that in India they were creating a Korean village. So the Korean businessmen coming to India would have housing and schools for their children in Korean language where they'd be comfortable. It was quite far-sighted.
I understand also that for, I think, Japan and Korea, the Modi government has created, or is a kind of a cell, which is, I don't want to say it's modeled on Kotra, but it's a little bit, it's supposed to be kind of like one-stop shopping for foreign investors, but specifically, the Indian bureaucracy is famously daunting. And also, I mean, it's such a big country, and there's so many local authorities, state authorities, layers and layers and layers. But this notion of a kind of an investment, one-stop shopping place is something that I think was, in some ways, if I could say, probably borrowed a little bit from East Asia, but set up for countries of specific interest. And Japan and Korea are two of them, maybe the only two, as far as I know.
Right. I mean, there's a point that Kathy made, which is worth paying attention to, which is, for Mr. Modi in particular, the Korean development model is really inspirational because it has a role for a developmental state, for a state that somehow orchestrates the evolution in the economic arena. But it still has room for private actors to be empowered, doing their thing, almost with the tacit guidance of the state, or the tacit approval of the state. That's the way he certainly operated in Gujarat. And he sees the connections that he is now attempting to make, particularly with big Korean business houses, as an effort to sort of reproduce in microscopic form that kind of a model in India. Now, obviously, it's hard to translate it simply, but the idea that there is a Korean model that is very appealing to him is really what drives these initiatives that he's undertaken to create single window approval mechanisms in the Prime Minister's office to aid the path to Korean and Japanese business. So let's see how it all comes out, but clearly the intentions are there.
India seems to have, it's becoming more modern, transitioning, but it seems like it's has a foot in the past too. When I was in Delhi most recently, I checked into a hotel in New Delhi. It was a spectacular, brand new silver hotel, glass and aluminum, rows of computer banks. When I checked in, they entered my reservation on the computer bank. And when they finished that, then they reached under the counter, pulled out a huge leather ledger, slapped the desk, opened it up, got a fountain pen out, and did it all over again. So I guess there's a way of being secure about it.
That's right. Think of it as a cyber insurance policy.
That's right. That's right.
I'm going to ask everyone to kind of give their views about what they think areas of cooperation may be between Korea and India, and for the United States, Korea and India. But before I open the general question up, I've got one more specific, and that's about human rights. Now, it strikes me as one area of potential difference. India, among a minority of countries, abstained during the December 2014 UN General Assembly vote condemning human rights abuses in North Korea. Now, does India generally abstain on human rights votes, or is that a special case? And given the importance of North Korea to Seoul, could that be a problem in the relationship?
My understanding is that India does generally abstain as a kind of a matter of principle on these human rights resolutions. I think there was maybe an exception in the case of Sri Lanka, given. I should defer to you on this. I don't have the sense that that's created a problem with Seoul, and I think it's also a matter of fact that India and the Republic of Korea are not going to act in lockstep on every on every issue. That said, I think Scott's point bears reinforcing that kind of the issue of proliferation of WMD is one where there are some shared concerns and where there would be, I think, an interest certainly on the, perhaps on both sides in seeing how they can cooperate.
This is a complicated issue for India because the Indian approach to human rights has generally been from the perspective of protecting state sovereignty. And this is a typical attitude for states that have come out of the colonial past. India has always taken the view that each country ought to find its own ways of managing human rights, of course, subject to universal principles. What it has been very uncomfortable with is extra state bodies, in a sense, commenting on or regulating human rights behaviors. And it has taken this position primarily out of self-interest because it has not wanted to put itself in a position where human rights bodies externally would comment on India's human rights record, particularly in states like Jammu and Kashmir, where there have been active insurrections, or in the Indian Northeast. So there is a defensive protection that has shaped Indian policy and this thinking. But as in everything in Indian foreign policy, right, things can be negotiated. So, for example, the historic Indian condemnation, for example, of Israel, which reached its peak in the 1970s, has now slowly mutated into a realism that recognizes that India has to be more even-handed when it comments on things involving Israeli-Palestinian issues. So for the first time last year, this year, we saw India actually refraining from condemning Israel in the Human Rights Council. So there is clearly a process of evolution. And as India becomes more confident of its own capabilities as a country in the global system, it might reach the point where it can actually take positions on these issues based on their merits, as opposed to simply a sort of uniform defensiveness, which puts them in the awkward position of refusing to condemn what are very blatant violations of human rights, simply on the grounds of protecting state sovereignty.
And Scott, to some extent, we could ask the same question of South Korea. The South Korean National Assembly has failed to pass a North Korean human rights resolution. Do you think that South Korea is going to be fighting this December in the General Assembly for that condemnation of North Korean human rights?
I think that the human rights issue is in a very interesting and a little bit odd position because now that it's on the Security Council agenda, in a way, if you go ahead and have a vote on it, it takes it off. And it also forces everybody to take a stand. And it's not clear necessarily that the result that people desire is yet baked into into the result. So I think that the question is, in some ways, I think that what's probably going to be more likely is that issue is going to remain there on the agenda as an issue that will be raised from time to time as a way of reminding the international community of the gravity of the North Korean human rights situation. But that there's actually not an incentive to try to drive toward a vote at this stage.
Okay, so then back to the general. Do we have ideas among the four of us, about what might be on the common agenda for Korea and India and U.S.?
Trilateral way.
Trilateral. Or bilateral.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is the beginning of, or not the beginning, but we're early in that conversation, and I think this is a part of it. And I would like to see more conversations at the, track 1, 1.5, 2, whatever, but levels of what we might just talk about on a trilateral basis as well as bilateral. I wanted to reinforce Scott's point about my shared a little bit of surprise that in Korea there doesn't seem to be the kind of focus on India, maybe because I just came out of India, that I might have expected. Just by pure coincidence, I happened to be staying in a hotel in Seoul that was the hotel that was used by Prime Minister Modi and his party when he visited in May. And I had the same reaction. I don't know if you were in Korea at that time that you did. I thought it didn't grab people the way that I thought maybe it would and should. Certainly, if you talk to business people, you see they know the challenges very well. They also see the opportunities. I will say I noticed that the chairman of Lotte was in India last week to open the second chocolate pie factory. So, maybe for export to China or something. But no. I mean, in terms of cooperation, let me just throw one out, and this is not in any order of priority, but we've development and development assistance. I can cite an example. I actually saw in my time in India, there was a group of very prominent Korean women who came to India to look at the issue of HIV/AIDS prevention. India has a very high infection rate. It disproportionately affects actually women and children, and it was a big eye-opener for them and for me. And we had a bit of, if you like, informal and kind of formal trilateral cooperation with some of the U.S. efforts, along with our Indian partners who have, again, huge human capacity in terms of research and development, pharmaceuticals, big industry, and as well as a great need at home. So I think both in terms of our respective ambitions for I think for India and Korea to play larger global roles. There are some complementarities between India and Korea and the United States in the, if you like, the development world, in the assistance world, as well as in technology and economics. Energy would be another one, but we could go through a list. You can see the kind of list that we've developed. We've had this high-level meetings over the last couple of years, and there's just actually quite a bit of overlap, if you like, between what India and Korea have agreed to do together, what India and the U.S. have agreed to go together, and bilateral the U.S. and Korea have been doing for some time in some cases, but where we're expanding. Cyber is another one. If Korea is the hardware power, India is the software power. The U.S. is somewhere in between. So I think we're just at the beginning of that conversation. It really needs to be deepened.
I would just take off on what Kathy said by emphasizing that the biggest challenge, I think, is to think seriously trilaterally. There are things that we do in terms of our individual bilateral relationships, the U.S. and Korea and the U.S. and India. And there are commonalities, there are points of intersection. But I don't think either of the three countries have given enough attention to what can be done trilaterally. So this is an effort that has to be made, and there are bureaucratic dimensions to this, there are ideational dimensions. But I think one has to think about this in a serious way. And if you don't do it, it's not going to happen naturally. Because these two countries, at least India and Korea, are in different worlds. And so there has to be some catalyzing function played by the United States if we want to go there. So that's point number one. Point number two, there are 2 or 3 areas there I think which are ripe for opportunity. The first is the future of Asian institutions and the future of the Asian regional order. It affects both India and Korea in different ways. The interests are convergent at the broadest levels of sort of grand strategy. And so it would be useful to have that conversation of what an institutional Asian order, both in the realm of security and economics, would ideally look like 10 years, 25 years out. So that would be one. The 2 areas practically where we can do things, I think, in the near term are first in the area of education, just adding to Kathy's list, because the Indians are deeply impressed by how Korea worked out its programs of technical skilling. And it's a big Indian need. It's also where the US has enormous experience through our community college system and a multi-tiered system of education. So there is some opportunity there. And the second would be, deepening society to society relations. Now we have very vibrant US-India society-to-society relations. But India's relations with both Korea and Japan have been either at the level of high politics, so it's the 2 governments talking about strategic issues like Pakistan, proliferation, or it's been purely commercial, so it's business to business. But the popular understanding and appreciation of each other, I think, is still lacking substantially. And so this is an opportunity for a role to create programs that would educate both societies about the other. And I think that will come in time naturally, but if one wants to accelerate it, I think it would have to be done, in a sense, from above, rather than waiting for nature to take its own course and produce something of value autonomously.
On the educational system, that movie 3 Idiots, which was about the Indian educational system, was very popular in South Korea. The South Korean students were intrigued by the idea that maybe you could do something not traditional with your education. So it came from India. Scott.
Well, I think Kathy and Ashley have pretty much just written the grant proposal for this trilateral cooperation framework. But what I would notice or note is that actually we've seen U.S., Japan, India. We've seen Japan, South Korea, India trilateral discussions, at least at an academic or policy kind of opinion leader type level. But there has not been a U.S., Korea, India dialogue of this sort. And that probably is a place to start in terms of exploring possibilities for convergence. Especially this broad institutional agenda in Asia is one that I think would benefit from more active involvement by Korea and India together. In specific terms, I would suggest that the maritime security area is one where because Korea had a role in the Gulf of Aden anti-piracy strategy, that happens to be on the other side of the Indo-Pacific, so they've passed through. Eventually I think that there may be a need for more active multilateral capacity building in the area of international norm enforcement in the maritime area. Don't know what that's going to look like or how long it's going to take to develop, but you can imagine that. Also, this issue of importing international norms into the regional context is an area where, frankly, we're struggling, I think, in the context of the East Asia Summit in practical terms, but it's an area that binds together the U.S., Korea, and India as countries that want to see law-based formulas for addressing disputes in the broader region. And so I think that that is another area where you could imagine a productive conversation among the three countries.
Yeah, before we open the floor for questions, let me just put one more question to Ambassador Stevens. Maybe others will want to answer too. It's more general. The U.S. seems to want the Republic of Korea and India to play a larger role on the world stage. But is there a balance to be struck between our encouraging to be active and the possibility they might do things we wouldn't necessarily approve of?
Yeah, I mean, I think as I look at it, I don't speak for the U.S. government, but I think it's pretty clear from what this administration has said over the last couple of years that that yes, first of all, we do want to see the United States sees it as in its interest to first of all see India prosper and grow. There's a great human need there, I think, first and foremost, that we can't forget. And to play a positive and larger role in the world. It's actually hard for me, I'm sure if I think hard enough, I can think of a few, hard for me to think of many areas where a more confident, economically prosperous, thriving India is somehow going to negatively impact upon U.S. core interests. Similarly, and I think for a number of years, we've seen the Republic of Korea play a larger role, whether it's under the rubric of global Korea or middle power, and that is a positive thing. And we could Scott has listed some already, but we could list some more. There will be some areas where our interests do not exactly align. I mean, certainly with respect to South Korea, I think during over the last few years, with both Korea and Japan. They were very reliant as energy-poor countries on Iranian oil. As we sought to pressure Iran in the context of our diplomatic efforts with Iran, we had to, on the one hand, understand that South Korea, as well as Japan, and actually as well as India, I should include, had a genuine problem. They needed this oil. We had to take that into account, and their growing economies obviously need more and more of it. But at the same time, I think we were able to find a way to reconcile those real needs with the priority that the U.S. and the international community placed on finding a way to get Iran to a diplomatic deal that would constrain its nuclear programs and ambitions.
The challenge that you described about countries going their own way, in different ways, is not entirely linked to what the U.S. wants or does not want. It's fundamentally linked to their own growth and capacity. And as these nations grow in capacity, they will find ways of pursuing their interests. Sometimes, at our expense, sometimes with some friction. To my mind, that's not necessarily, an insurmountable problem. As long as we have a common understanding about the kind of world we want to build and preserve, there should be enough room for countries pursuing their own interests. And when there are differences, the efforts to reconcile those differences have to take place through diplomatic consultation. The good news, as far as the US, Korea, and India are concerned, from my vantage point, is that there are no fundamental conflicts of interest. And therefore, if there are discrepancies in how we pursue our interests, all those discrepancies are susceptible to diplomatic solutions if you're willing to make the investments in diplomacy. And the example of getting Korea and India to come on board with respect to our policy towards Iran was a great example. We're going to have another opportunity to test this proposition out with respect to climate change in the next few months. So, to my mind, the fact that there are no fundamental conflicts of interest really provides me great reassurance that we're never going to get to the point where we will end up in cul-de-sacs which we cannot sort of break out of. All the rest, to my mind, are disagreements about detail. And that's where, America's finest, which Kathy is a great example, will earn their living doing what they do best. And we've seen this. I mean, I have seen this in the US-India relationship for the last 30 years, where we've not seen eye to eye on a lot of things. And yet we've come out of the relationship actually in some ways stronger, because we don't have to hide our disagreements in the hope that, the other side won't notice, or that the other side will be so peeved that relations will melt down. I mean, it requires a certain maturity on our part to understand that there will be differences. The key is that we protect the liberal order that the United States built, because it's an order that serves not only our own interests, but it creates enough space for all these other partners of ours, irrespective of what their capabilities are.
I mean, Ashley just hit on the key point, I think, and not to get too philosophical, but basically it ends up being a question of whether or not you're more concerned with primacy or with the liberal order, right? And I think that if the liberal order is sustained and we have an inclusive system, then I think that there's much less concern, should be much less concern about this issue of primacy. Maybe I'll provoke Ashley with that a little bit. I don't know.
Don't.
It's really the quality of inclusiveness versus exclusivity that I think makes the difference there. And so as long as we're moving towards, the order that the U.S. has kind of already set, which I think is basically based on an inclusivity and norms based on law, then that's actually a foundation that all three of these countries can thrive in. But if we see threats to the international order that move in the direction of exclusivity or exceptionalism, those are the areas that we have problems with, like with North Korea treating itself as exceptionalist, concerns about China's rise and the direction it's going to go in. Those are the real challenges. And I personally don't think that Korea or India would be interested in moving in a direction that would support an order that would have those qualities.
But can I ask a question? If I had to follow, I mean,
That's a lot.
That's a lot. I mean, I think there's sometimes some skepticism, if I may say, expressed about India's political will and readiness to participate in this liberal order fully, whether it's through, APEC is often talked about, or TPP on the trade side. I'd be interested in I think you have been a proponent of India doing that, but why is there the skepticism, and do you think the challenges are going to be addressed?
I think we have to see this in the context of India's own evolution. Right? When India was performing at less than par, the liberal order was often a source of threat to India. So, for example, when you talked about human rights, when you talked about global norms, these were not seen as structural conditions that advance the good of all. They were seen as weapons in the hands of the strong, which might be directed against India. But as India becomes more confident and more capable, it begins to see the benefits to itself of upholding such an order. Now, this transformation in Indian policy is not going to come about overnight. But to Indians who think about the kind of world they want over the long term, I think those Indians see clearly that all the alternatives to the current liberal order are alternatives that leave India worse off. And even when it comes to power configurations, right, if you talk to Indians who have thought about this, they'll tell you, of course, the first best option for them is a multipolar world where they are, part of the global management team. But that multipolar world is nowhere on the horizon, and we ought not to kid ourselves. So if you confront them with the alternatives to multipolarity, at least in the near term, which is essentially continued American primacy, or a new bipolar world with China and the United States being the poles, most Indians will gravitate to the first and not the second, because their interests are better served in that world where the United States stands alone. So there is a process of evolution that's going on, and it's a battle that will take many years to win. But I think in our diplomacy, it is something that we need to engage them, because unless we sort of trigger the reflection through a conversation, oftentimes, you leave the forces of inertia to decide Indian policy rather than evoking some sort of reflection and change.
If I just one thing that really, I know we're going to open to questions. One thing that really struck me living in India for the first time and arriving at a time when U.S.-India relations had gone through a rather rough patch. We know those in South Korea sometimes too. Was the fact that public opinion polling, as well as just kind of talking to people, reflected, and what the elite had to say, that the groundswell of, or the if you like, the grassroots support for a strong relation to the United States was very, very strong. And in fact, it struck me that the Indian elite, who in some cases came out of an elite that was historically very skeptical of the United States and very skeptical of entangling not even alliances, but engagements by India with the United States, and a whole history behind that, that those in the elites were saying, we are actually, we need to respond to our electorate, which wants to see us have a good relationship. This is a fundamental kind of, I think, strength in the relationship. And to me, as someone who'd spent a lot of time over the years in Korea, was a little bit of a contrast, because what I've heard from this, this very close relationship we have with South Korea over the years, was oftentimes to the elite is, we have to explain to our people why this is so important. It's a little bit more of a top-down thing. So the end result, I think, is leaderships in both democracies who want to strengthen the relationship, but the if you like, the historical and the cultural context for it is really quite different even now.
Right, at this point I'll show some self-control. I would love to ask about WTO, but I won't. To give our audience a chance to ask questions, please, sir. Yeah, there are some microphones. It's on the way.
Enjoyable talk. We came in a little late, but I don't think you commented on the potential slowdown of China's economy, and how that might affect some of these relations. Specifically, we heard from someone from the Confederation of India Industry yesterday suggest that, if China hits less than 7% this year, and India might be at 7% GDP growth rate, we're seeing a fundamental shift in growth in the region. And they aspire to 10% growth, according to the CII director. So are we seeing a shift in economic growth, and how will that affect trade, business, and foreign policy matters with these nations?
I think it's too early to declare that there is going to be a shift. And the reason for that has less to do with relative growth rates and more to do with scale. The Chinese economy is still huge, and compared to India. And even though there will be relative slowing, there's no doubt about it, in the next 2 to 3 years, even a China that slows down to 6%, or maybe even slightly less than 6%, will still have an enormous economic mass that shapes Asian calculations in a way that I do not think India can aspire to, at least within the time frame that policy. No, this is not being humble. This is being realistic. I think India has grand aspirations. It has always had grand aspirations. In recent years, it's been quite commonplace to talk about a 10%. The bold even talk of a 10+% rate of growth. I would be willing to sort of countenance that as a possibility if I see a much more aggressive Indian reform effort at home. And thus far, I have seen an abundance of caution. So it is possible that India will sort of slowly inch up to that 10%, but it won't happen soon. And it certainly will not happen at the current rate of economic reform. So I wouldn't get too excited about gravitational shifts just yet. But having said that, the one point I would keep in mind is that Indian democracy really has an enormous advantage from the point of view of growth in two ways. One is that you will not see violent shifts of national policy, because democratic regimes generally tend to hew to the mean. And two, Indian democracy has now started making demands of its political leadership for sustained high levels of growth, which means that success is rewarded and failure is penalized in domestic politics. And that has changed the calculus very much of how Indian politicians think about the need for growth. And so that leaves me with a certain optimism about India. But nothing that I've said in the last few seconds transforms my earlier proposition that if you're looking for gravitational shifts in a hurry, those are not.
Florence?
Florence Lowley from the Global America Business Institute. This question is to Mr. Tellis, and it's an unfair question. Who said all the question has to be fair, right? Recently in June, U.S. and Korea had agreed on civil nuclear agreement. And since you were involved with the U.S.-Indian civil nuclear agreement, as a former U.S. government official and diplomat, do you think both agreements, comparing to U.S. With Indian agreement to South agreement, was it balanced, equally balanced? On the other word, this is a scale. U.S. in the middle, Korea and India. Was it tipped in one way or another in favoritism toward one country or another country? Or was it completely balanced? And I said it's unfair because I know it's a different package and it's a different time of era, but talking about in general terms.
As a State Department spokesman, I would say immediately I don't deal in hypotheticals. Right?
That's right.
But I'll hazard a guess at the level of principle. It's very hard to compare the two for a very simple reason. That the agreement with India was in many ways an extraordinary agreement. It was an extraordinary agreement because India is not a signatory to the NPT, whereas Korea is. And therefore, the agreement with Korea, which is the standard 1-2-3 agreement we signed with all NPT partners, follows a certain template. And the Korean agreement is no better or no worse than any of the other 123 agreements that we've signed with others in principle. There may be some differences of detail, but not in principle. India was radically different because we had to make adjustments for a country that has an active nuclear weapons program, that will not give up its nuclear weapons program, that is not a signatory to the NPT, and yet would be a party to nuclear cooperation, not simply with the United States, but with all countries who are members of the NSG. So the Indian agreement was no doubt an extraordinarily generous agreement. There is no doubt about it. And I will just say this, I don't want to be negotiating such an agreement again.
We had a question here, please.
Thank you. It's a very interesting panel, and my mind is spinning in so many different directions. The one point that strikes me is Scott Snyder reference to Korea, the middle-income country. And I was reminded of the recent death of Lee Kuan Yew. And I wanted to ask him about the comparison. Lee Kuan Yew was a world-class analyst of global trends because if he did not understand these global trends, Singapore could be wiped out. Is there a similarity with Korea? Because different from the Japanese who are so inward-looking, Americans who are so preoccupied with themselves, Indians who are in a different world, as you said, Koreans cannot survive if they are not global in outlook at the national level. I was in Seoul again this year and was very struck by the openness to world information that I don't see. I happen to be in China. China is so preoccupied. It's such a big country that they discuss domestic affairs. So my point is, do you think that comparison is valid, that Korea has no choice but being global because it's a matter of survival, the same way that Singapore had to be global to survive, because it could be, you remember the old proverb about if whales fight, shrimps get crushed? It's a new version, but your concept of middle-income economies makes a lot of sense to me, but does it apply to Korea in the way I articulated it?
Well, I actually primarily talked about Korea's middle power concept, and if I get into middle income, I'm really getting into your territory. Yeah, yeah, but I think that, so there's a dilemma, I think, that Korea faces right now in the context of its alliance relations with the United States, and that is that it critically needs the alliance for the United States for security. But because it's a middle power in a country, in a region that is dominated by larger powers, in some respects, Koreans know that U.S. foreign policy making is always focused on China or Japan first. The alliance is still contingent in some way on other issues. And the best antidote for South Korea to pursue in order to avoid that risk is actually to deepen its strategic value, actually by giving the kind of advice to the United States that Lee Kuan Yew gave to the United States. And so if I were going to give one piece of advice to South Korean foreign policy specialists, it would be, develop your own strategic perspective that takes account of the region, not just the sub-region, and really leverage the relationship with the United States, to be the Asian party that whispers in the U.S. ear and actually helps us to have course corrections before we go too far astray.
Professor Rosman.
Gil Rosman, the ASEAN Forum. Ashley, I know, has warned us about hypotheticals, but I have a hypothetical. Supposing this panel had been Japan instead of South Korea, how much would have been similar and how much would have been different? Because it seems to me that the U.S. view of Japan and Korea and Japan's view of Japan, India, and Japan's view of its relationship with India has many striking parallels. But let me just point to 3 or 4 themes and see if you want to comment on them. Japan seems to see India in a much more of a security framework. What will India do in the South China Sea? How can it be brought into a security relationship? Japan emphasizes the China factor a lot. There's this image that China, a lot of it is about China. Japan also, with Abe in particular, thinking that there's a special values connection, and that's actually the opposite almost of the Korea-India connection, that India really accepted Japan's liberation of Asia in some sense, in part because of the vote at the Tokyo Tribunal that Abe so much seems to appreciate. Is there essentially the same U.S. hopes for Japan and South Korea in their relationship with India, or is there something very different about them, and are they likely to cooperate in more than a trilateral, or is this in important ways a competitive relationship?
I like the term that you use, that there are interesting parallels. But to me, the big difference is that there is no conscious US, Korea, India trilateral that is driven by US policy in a way that there is a Japan, India, US trilateral, which is shaped very much by our concerns about the future of the Asian order. And you're absolutely right to point out that in the US, India, Japan case, security calculations are paramount because they are central for all the three players in this relationship. The US cares about what happens to its primacy in Asia. India cares about its own security vis-a-vis China. And Japan cares about its own security vis-a-vis China. Korea is not exactly in the analogous position to the same degree. And so, at least for the foreseeable future, I think the US, India, Japan triangle will certainly enjoy much greater leadership attention because of the importance of high politics. Whereas in the US, India, Korea triangle, the potential and the aspirations are there, but I do not see pressing issues at the level of high politics that would bring the leaderships together to shape the evolution of this triangle in any particular direction. I may be wrong on this, but this is certainly my reading of the two at this point in time.
So I actually think that another cut at this is actually to go back and look historically, because this is really the second round of Abe's romancing of India, right? But back in 2006, 2007, when Abe was prime minister the first time, Roh Moo-hyun was president in South Korea, and South Korea really wanted to avoid that conversation about like-minded cooperation among U.S., Japan, Australia, et cetera. So I found it very interesting when Prime Minister Abe went to Delhi that one of the things that was featured was the security element, and that Korea wasn't named, right? And I think that actually it's true that basically Korea is hedging and engaging with China. I think Tokyo under Abe is really doing a little bit more balancing. And so, in a way, I'm not sure that Korea necessarily wants to stand up and be counted as far as that goes. It's, in some ways, I think that actually Korea and India have similar feelings, interestingly enough, in terms of how they want to manage their respective relationships with Beijing. The question is, what is the threshold going to be in terms of what sort of activity China would engage in that might draw out either or both of them into a stronger kind of collective defense approach to security in the region. And then I think that the other issue there is that there's also some work to be done in terms of understanding how Korea fits into the broader U.S. rebalance. Korea under Park Geun-hye has a very clear sub-regional approach with their NAFC, Northeast Asia Peace and Cooperation Initiative, but the issue of the region, I think, remains as an issue for further, deeper discussion between the U.S. and South Korea.
Yeah, I mean, these are all excellent points, and I think it takes us back to, I think, what Ashley was emphasizing earlier of I mean, just the development of I mean, how regional architecture, if you like, develops, and in particular what Korea's role is. But I mean, India and Australia also have a romance going on, or romance, or whatever, and you do get into, and we've been there before in a way, that question of, as you get like-minded countries together who want to pursue the liberal order, to what extent does that look like, or is explicitly encircling or containing China? So, I mean, that's still the world we're in, and I think the Japan-Korea comparison in this case with India, I think your points are very well taken. No, there is a different tone to some of it, but at the same time, there are many similarities for obvious reasons as well.
Okay, we'll take one more question. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Chang. I'm a research assistant at the Embassy of India. And South Korea has supported India's bid to join the Nuclear Suppliers Group the Australia Group, and these other multilateral export control regimes. And this is one of India's, foreign policy goals on the international stage. Notably, China has opposed India's bid to join the nuclear suppliers group, but South Korea is a member of all four groups, and it supports India. And India is also trying to gain a seat in the P5 in the UN Security Council, and South Korea broadly supports kind of reform within the UN Security Council to make it more diverse and representative. And so I was wondering, what is the potential for South Korea and India to develop their relationship within international institutions or on global governance issues and especially on non-proliferation. I mean, is the fact that India is not a signatory to the NPT a major stumbling block in India, South Korea efforts on non-proliferation?
It's a question with multiple dimensions, so let me just say 2 or 3 things that might address some of these. I think South Korea's ability to shape UN reform is probably more modest, because whether UN reform takes place or not will really depend on the P5 and the interests of the P5. So South Korea's broad endorsement of an Indian presence on the P5, I think, is probably welcomed in Delhi, but I think there's a realistic appreciation that it's not going to make the difference. In the NSG, though, the dynamic is very different, because depending on how vocal South Korea wants to be in the NSG meetings, it could play a huge role, because South Korea has a very vibrant nuclear industry. It carries weight because of its standing in the entire nuclear regime, and because it's also dealing with a very pesky nuclear threat of its own. So I think South Korea really has an opportunity there to leverage its membership in the NSG if it wants to be helpful. It's been very supportive, at least publicly, of an Indian membership in the NSG. So on those 2 counts, I think that's where things stack up. Broadly on non-proliferation, I think there are 2 questions that you asked. One is, can cooperation be envisaged vis-a-vis North Korea and vis-a-vis the broader non-proliferation regime, and whether India's lack of signature on the NPT becomes an obstacle. On the second question, I think the answer is not anymore. That is, India's refusal to sign the NPT is no longer a stumbling block for cooperation with South Korea, in part because the United States essentially brokered India's entry into the global regime. With respect to North Korea, I think there is actually much greater potential than has been realized. I alluded to the intelligence sharing that both sides have an ambition. I think that's very, very fruitful. It's in the interests of both countries, because we haven't heard the last of the North Korean nuclear program. We don't know what shape it's going to take, and we don't know what North Korea's access to the international nuclear black market continues to be. So there is a great deal of opportunity that can be realized there. And I think that might be the device to actually get India to think seriously about how it relates to North Korean human rights and North Korea more generally. Because if India changes its view on that, it will be because its interests are served in other areas. There are issue linkages. And so if South Korea plays the role that I think Indians hope it will in the NSG, then I think it might open the space for India to take a more, shall we say, reasonable position on North Korean human rights issues than it has in the past.
Okay, there's clearly much more we could talk about, but time is up. So please join me in thanking our panelists in the traditional way for their excellent presentations. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to KEI. Your homework is to continue.